The Quiet Hours. Stories for Sleep. Welcome, and thank you for being here tonight. If you're new to this channel, this is a place for slow, true stories, real lives, real history, told gently, for anyone who needs a quiet moment before sleep. If you'd like, leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's always good to know who's settling in with us. And if these stories help you relax, even just a little, consider subscribing. It helps this small channel keep telling them. Now, let's begin. It was the kind of evening in Picardy when the light seemed to take its time, leaving the sky, settling low and gold over the wheat fields before finally letting the dark in. And somewhere in the small town of Montdidier, in the year 1737, a wood fire was being lit in the back room of an inn, filling the narrow street outside with the smell of smoke and roasting chestnuts. It was in a house not far from that same street that a boy was born that year who would grow up to spend his life among jars of dried herbs and small brass scales, and who would, in the slow and unglamorous way that real lives tend to unfold, help feed a nation without ever raising his voice to do it. His name was Antoine Parmentier, and this is the story of how a village apothecary's careful, patient hands came to change what was grown in the fields of France. Montdidier, in the middle of the 18th century, was a modest market town, the kind of place where everyone knew the baker's schedule and the church bells marked the hours more reliably than any clock. Parmentier's father worked in trade, nothing grand, and the family's means were ordinary rather than comfortable, which meant that when Antoine Augustin showed an aptitude for learning, the path that opened to him was not university, but apprenticeship. At a young age, still more boy than man, he was sent to train under an apothecary, and it was there, standing at a wooden counter worn smooth by decades of use, that he first learned the quiet rituals of the trade that would shape the rest of his life. He learned to grind dried roots into fine powder with a stone mortar, to measure tinctures by the drop, to recognize the particular bitterness of wormwood and the sweetness of licorice root by scent alone before he ever needed to taste them. The apothecary's shop where he trained was lined with rows of ceramic jars, each one labeled in a careful, looping hand, and the light that came through the shop's small windows in the late afternoon would catch the dust suspended in the air, turning it gold, the way it does in old rooms that have held the same kind of work for a very long time. The apprenticeship itself followed a rhythm that repeated, day after day, season after season, with almost no variation, and it was in that repetition that the real education lay. Each morning began before the shop opened to customers. With the sweeping of the floor and the checking of the stock, the jars turned so their labels faced outward, the mortar and pestle cleaned of whatever had been ground in them the evening before. There were errands to run through the streets of Montdidier, collecting herbs that local gatherers brought in from the surrounding countryside, chamomile and mint and elderflower gathered from hedgerows and riverbanks, still faintly damp with morning dew when they arrived at the shop's back door. There was the slow, careful work of drying these plants in the loft above the shop, spread thin on cloth so the air could move through them, and the equally careful work of testing whether a batch of dried root had lost its potency, judged by smell and by the way it crumbled between the fingers. None of this was taught quickly. It was taught the way most useful things are taught, through years of small correction, a master apothecary glancing over a boy's shoulder to adjust the angle of a blade or the proportion of a mixture, until eventually the correction was no longer needed. There is something worth sitting with, in this early part of the story, about what it meant to be an apothecary's apprentice in provincial France in those years. It was not romantic work. It involved long hours of repetitive, careful labor, the boiling and cooling and straining of remedies, the endless recopying of recipes into ledgers, the sweeping of a stone floor at the end of each day. But it also meant becoming, slowly and almost without noticing, a person who paid close attention to the physical world, to weights and measures and the way substances behaved when mixed or heated or left to sit. It was a kind of education in patience, and patience would turn out to be the defining quality of Parmentier's entire life, though neither he nor anyone around him could have known that yet. He continued his training into his 20s, and eventually, as was common for young men of his trade at the time, he found his way into military service as an apothecary, which in that period meant serving with the army's medical corps rather than carrying a weapon. This was during the 7 Years' War, a long and grinding conflict that drew France into fighting across much of Europe, and Parmentier's service took him to the front lines not as a soldier but as the quiet figure responsible for the army's medicines, moving with the supply trains, setting up makeshift dispensaries, treating fevers and wounds with whatever herbs and tinctures could be carried or found. It was demanding, uncertain work, following an army through unfamiliar country, sleeping in requisitioned barns and army tents, learning to make do with short supplies and long distances between towns that might carry what he needed. The campaigns of those years carried him through unfamiliar country in Central Europe, past villages whose church bells rang in rhythms slightly different from the ones he had grown up with, through forests and along muddy roads churned by the passage of supply wagons and artillery. Parmentier set up his small dispensaries wherever the army paused, a folding table, a set of scales, whatever herbs and prepared remedies could be carried in cases strapped to a cart. And he learned, in these years, a different kind of patience than the one his Montdidier apprenticeship had taught him, the patience required to make limited supplies stretch across the needs of far too many men. During this war, Parmentier was captured by Prussian forces, and this happened to him not once but several times over the course of his service, each time resulting in a period of imprisonment before an exchange or release could be arranged. Being taken prisoner in that era was not always a swift or brutal affair. It often meant a long stretch of confinement in modest conditions, fed on whatever rations the captors themselves depended on, and it was during one of these periods of captivity in Prussia that Parmentier's life quietly turned toward the subject that would define his legacy. The prisoners in his camp were fed, day after day, on a simple, humble food that the French at the time regarded with real suspicion and even distaste: the potato. In France, in those years, the potato carried a strange reputation. It was widely believed, without much evidence beyond old superstition, that eating potatoes could cause leprosy, and the crop was associated so strongly with animal feed that respectable households would not have considered serving it at their tables. It had even been the subject of formal prohibition in some regions, banned from cultivation on the grounds that it was harmful to human health. And yet here was Parmentier, month after month in a Prussian prison, eating potatoes prepared simply, boiled or roasted, alongside the other captured men, and finding, in the most practical and immediate way possible, that they sustained him. He did not fall ill, he did not weaken in the way that malnutrition would have caused. Instead, he found himself thinking, with the same careful attention he had once given to a mortar full of dried herbs, about what exactly this vegetable was, and why it had been dismissed so completely by his own country's farmers and physicians. It would be pleasant to imagine some single dramatic moment of realization, a flash of insight in a cold cell, but the truth of how Parmentier's thinking developed was almost certainly slower and quieter than that, more like the gradual clearing of fog than a sudden burst of light. Imprisonment gave him long, unstructured hours, and a mind trained since boyhood to notice the properties of the things he ate and touched. Somewhere in those months of captivity, eating of food his own country feared, he began to form the idea that would occupy the rest of his working life, that the potato, so plain and so unfairly maligned, might be one answer to a problem that had haunted France for generations: the recurring, devastating threat of famine. The seasons of captivity passed slowly, as captivity tends to. The days marked less by events than by the simple recurrence of meals and weather, the changing light through whatever small window his quarters allowed, the sound of other prisoners' voices in languages he did not always understand. There is no record of any single day that stood apart from the others, no dramatic scene of hardship or defiance, only the long, ordinary accumulation of time passing while a young man ate what he was given and, almost without meaning to, began to think differently about it. When the war ended and Parmentier was finally released and made his way back to France, he did not return to Montdidier to resume a quiet provincial practice. Instead, he went to Paris, drawn by the city's growing scientific culture, and he began to study more formally, attending lectures and working under established chemists of the day, deepening the practical knowledge of his apprenticeship with the more rigorous methods of the emerging science of chemistry. Paris in this period was a city of contrasts, grand and filthy in equal measure, its streets crowded with carts and street vendors, its air carrying the mingled smells of the Seine, of baking bread, of horse and tallow smoke. And somewhere within all of that noise and motion, a former army apothecary spent his days in laboratories, running quiet, careful experiments on the composition of plants and grains, still turning over, in the back of his mind, the question the Prussian prison camps had planted there. It is worth pausing here, in this part of the story, simply to sit with the ordinariness of it. Parmentier was not, at this stage, a famous man, nor even a particularly notable one. He was one among many trained men in Paris, working quietly in laboratories, publishing modest papers, attending the meetings of scientific societies, building a reputation slowly, the way most real reputations are built, through years of unremarkable, careful work rather than any single dramatic event. The city outside his window went on with its business. The seasons turned, the bells of Parisian churches marked the hours as they had in Montdidier, and Parmentier continued his quiet study of grains, flowers, and the potato that had first caught his attention in a foreign prison. The turning point, when it came, arrived not through any personal drama, but through an institutional one. In 1772, the Academy of Besançon announced a prize competition, inviting scholars to submit essays addressing a serious and practical question: what food substances might be used to reduce the suffering caused by famine in years when the wheat harvest failed? France in the 18th century remained vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic crop failures that could mean widespread hunger across entire provinces, and the Academy's question was not an abstract or academic one. It was a genuine plea for practical solutions to a recurring national crisis. Parmentier submitted an essay arguing, with the careful, evidence-based reasoning of a man who had studied the subject for years, that the potato deserved reconsideration, that it was nutritious, safe, and capable of growing reliably even in poor soil where wheat might fail. He won the prize. Winning an academic essay competition, however, does not by itself change what farmers plant or what families eat, and Parmentier understood this well. The old suspicions surrounding the potato ran deep, reinforced by generations of superstition and, in places, by actual legal prohibitions on its cultivation. Convincing an entire agricultural nation to embrace a crop it had feared for as long as anyone could remember would require more than a well-argued essay. It would require patience, persistence, and, as it turned out, a fair amount of quiet cleverness. Parmentier spent the years that followed working to change the reputation of the potato through demonstration rather than argument alone. He understood that people are moved less by essays than by what they can see and taste and touch, and so he set about creating occasions where the potato could present itself, so to speak, on its own terms. He arranged dinners, modest but carefully composed, where every dish, from soup to bread to dessert, was made in some way from potatoes, and he invited guests of genuine standing and curiosity to these meals, men interested in science and progress, willing to taste something unfamiliar without the old fear attached to it. Among those who is recorded as having attended such gatherings and taken a genuine interest in Parmentier's work was Benjamin Franklin, then in France as a representative of the young United States, a man himself deeply curious about agriculture and practical science. It is easy enough to picture what such an evening might have looked like: candles burning low over a long table, the particular starchy warmth rising from a tureen of potato soup, plates of bread made from potato flour set alongside the more familiar wheat loaves so that guests could taste the difference for themselves, the conversation turning, as it often did among that circle of thinkers, from the food in front of them to the larger questions of how a nation might feed itself more reliably. Parmentier also found a valued collaborator in these years in the chemist Antoine Lavoisier, whose own careful, methodical studies of combustion and composition mirrored the kind of patient measurement Parmentier had practiced since his apprenticeship, and the two men's shared interest in the chemistry of nutrition, in what made one food more sustaining than another, gave Parmentier's arguments about the potato a scientific weight that mere enthusiasm could never have provided on its own. It was around this time, too, that Parmentier is remembered for a particular piece of quiet theatre involving the highest levels of French society. He is said to have presented potato blossoms, the small, unassuming white and pale purple flowers of the plant, to the royal court, and the story, carried down through the years, holds that King Louis XVI wore one in his buttonhole and that Queen Marie Antoinette wore the flowers in her hair. Whether every detail of this account survives with perfect historical precision is difficult to say with certainty after so much time, but the underlying truth is well established. The royal court did take a public interest in Parmentier's efforts, and the sight of the potato flower being worn as an ornament by the most fashionable people in France did a great deal, in a country that took its cues from the court, to soften the old prejudice against the plant. But it is the story of the guarded field that best captures the particular kind of patient cleverness that seemed to define Parmentier's approach to his life's work, and this part of the story is well documented in the records of the period. Parmentier obtained a plot of poor, sandy land at Les Sablons, near Neuilly on the outskirts of Paris, land not considered good for much of anything, and he planted it with potatoes. Then, rather than simply letting the crop grow unremarked, he arranged for the field to be guarded by soldiers, but only during the day. At night, the guards were withdrawn. It does not take much imagination to understand what happened next, and it seems Parmentier understood human nature rather well. The sight of armed guards protecting a field by day suggested, to the ordinary people who passed by or heard of it, that whatever grew there must be valuable, worth protecting, worth having. And so, under cover of darkness, when no one stood watch, local people came and dug up potatoes to take home and plant in their own gardens, believing they were getting away with something precious. Parmentier had, of course, wanted exactly this to happen. He had turned an old prejudice into a kind of curiosity, and curiosity, once planted in enough gardens across enough seasons, does more to change a country's habits than any number of published essays ever could. The years that followed this period brought a slow but real transformation in how the potato was regarded across France. It was, again, not a sudden revolution, but a gradual widening of acceptance, region by region, harvest by harvest, as farmers who had once refused to plant the crop began, cautiously, to set aside a portion of poor land for it, and as the old fear of leprosy and animal feed gave way, little by little, to the practical understanding that here was a food that could be relied upon even when the wheat failed. Parmentier continued his work through these years with the same unhurried thoroughness that had marked his apprenticeship decades earlier, publishing further studies not only on the potato but on other food sources, on the making of bread from alternative flours during times of grain scarcity, on the nutritional properties of chestnuts, always returning to the same underlying concern that had first taken shape in him during those months of Prussian captivity: how to keep ordinary people fed through the hard, uncertain years that agriculture in that era so often brought. France in these decades was hardly a settled place. The revolution arrived, and with it the fall of the monarchy that had once worn Parmentier's potato flowers as an ornament, followed by years of upheaval, war, and shifting governments that touched nearly every institution in the country. Through all of it, Parmentier's own position seems to have rested on something steadier than politics: the plain and largely uncontroversial usefulness of feeding people, and he continued to be called upon for his expertise regardless of who held power in Paris. He took on responsibilities connected to military pharmacy and public health administration, eventually overseeing matters at the Hôtel des Invalides, the great institution built to house and care for old and wounded soldiers, a fitting enough posting for a man who had first learned the value of careful nursing while attached to an army decades earlier. In these same years, he also became a quiet, persistent advocate for smallpox inoculation, applying to that cause the same evidence-based patience he had once applied to the potato, gathering data, publishing findings, trying gently and repeatedly to shift public opinion on a matter where fear and superstition still ran deep. There is a kind of quiet worth noticing in how Parmentier's later career unfolded, a settling into steady, useful work rather than any dramatic rise to fame. He became involved in the administration of pharmacy and public health in France, eventually overseeing matters connected to military and civilian medicine, and he continued to be consulted on questions of food and nutrition as France passed through the upheavals of revolution and the years that followed. Through all of this political turbulence around him, the wars and changes of government that reshaped the country during his lifetime, Parmentier's own work remained remarkably consistent in its focus, still concerned with the same plain, practical question he had first turned over in his mind as a young prisoner of war: how might people be kept fed? The winters passed, as winters do, one after another, each one a little less uncertain for French families than it might once have been, now that the potato had taken its place alongside wheat and rye as a crop that could be relied upon in poor soil and hard seasons. It is impossible to know precisely how many people were spared real hunger over the decades because of the slow change in attitude that Parmentier had helped bring about, but agricultural historians generally agree that the wider adoption of the potato across France and much of Europe in this period made a genuine difference in the resilience of the food supply, a quiet kind of protection against the famines that had shaped so much suffering in earlier generations. Parmentier lived to see much of this change take root in both the literal and figurative sense, continuing his work into old age with the same careful attention he had brought to his apprenticeship as a boy in Montdidier. He died in December of 1813, in his 76th year, in Paris, the city where he had spent so much of his working life turning a prison ration into a national resource. He was buried in the Père Lachaise cemetery, and there is a detail passed down about his grave that feels, in its own understated way, like the most fitting possible ending to this particular story. Potato plants, it is said, were grown around the site, a small living tribute to the quiet, patient work of a man who had spent his life convincing a wary country to trust a humble, unassuming vegetable. It is worth sitting for a moment before this story closes with what kind of a life this actually was. There was no single dramatic triumph, no one moment where everything changed at once. There was instead a long unfolding of small, careful actions, an apprenticeship spent learning to measure and observe, a captivity endured with more curiosity than despair, an essay written and submitted without any guarantee it would matter, a field planted and guarded in a manner clever enough to invite exactly the kind of theft that would spread its contents across the countryside, dinners hosted, flowers presented, decades of unglamorous administrative work carried out long after the more memorable stories had already been told. It was the kind of life built almost entirely from patience, the sort of patience that does not announce itself, that simply keeps doing the next necessary thing, season after season, until one day an entire nation's table has quietly changed. The apothecary's shop in Montdidier, where a boy once learned to grind herbs by hand, is long gone now, along with the smell of wood smoke that filled its street on the evening he was born. But something of that early training seems to have stayed with Parmentier through every stage of what came after. The same careful hands, the same close attention to small physical facts, applied first to tinctures, and then, in time, to the feeding of a nation. There is a particular kind of dignity in that continuity, in a life that never really changed its essential character, even as its scale grew from a single shop counter to the fields of an entire country. And so the story settles here, the way most real stories eventually do, not with a triumphant flourish, but with a quiet field outside Paris, guarded by day and left open by night, and with potato flowers growing, still, around a grave in a cemetery that has by now seen more than 2 centuries pass over it. The work was slow. The change it brought about was slower still, but it held, the way patient things tend to hold, long after the person who began it has gone quiet himself. Thank you for spending this time here, in the slow unfolding of a life that asked nothing more than to be useful, one careful season at a time. If it is evening where this finds you, let the story settle now the way the light once settled over Montdidier, gently, without hurry, as the rest of the world grows quiet around you. Sleep well. There was a particular quality to a Chicago afternoon in the middle of the 20th century, a certain slant of light off the lake, a smell of exhaust and popcorn and cold concrete drifting through the loop. If a person had happened to be walking those streets on any ordinary weekday in the 1950s or 1960s, they might have passed, without a second glance, a tall woman in a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat, a boxy camera hanging from a strap around her neck, her eyes moving quietly over the crowd the way a person's eyes move over something they have decided, quite privately, is worth remembering. No one stopped to ask her name. Almost no one, for the better part of her life, ever saw what she was making. Her name was Vivian Maier, and this is the story of a woman who spent most of her days caring for other people's children, and nearly all of her private hours making photographs that the world would not see until after she was gone. Vivian Maier was born in New York City in February of 1926 into a family that was, from the very beginning, somewhat scattered and difficult to pin down. Her mother was French, from a small mountain region in the southeast of the country, and her father was of Austrian background, and the marriage between them did not hold together in any steady way. This left Vivian's childhood divided between 2 very different worlds, the crowded boroughs of New York and the quiet, high mountain air of Saint Bonnet-en-Champsaur, a small village in the Hautes Alpes where her mother's family had roots going back generations. She spent stretches of her early years in this village, among stone houses and narrow lanes, and the particular hush of a place surrounded by mountains. and it is here most historians of her life believe that she first picked up a simple camera, drawn to the way it let her hold onto a moment a little longer than her own eyes could manage alone. The village itself sat in a high valley ringed by peaks that stayed capped with snow well into the warmer months, its stone houses clustered close together along narrow lanes that had changed little in generations, the air carrying a particular clean coldness even in summer, mixed with the smell of wood smoke and drying hay from the surrounding fields. It was a place where the rhythms of daily life still followed the seasons closely, where the arrival of a stranger with a camera might have been noted and discussed for days. It was here, among the mountain quiet, that Vivian Maier first learned to see the world the way a photographer eventually learns to see it, patiently, with attention to the particular fall of light across a stone wall or the exact posture of an old woman resting in a doorway. It would be easy to imagine this early exposure to photography as the beginning of some grand, declared ambition, but nothing in what is known of Vivian Maier's life suggests she ever thought of herself, publicly, as an artist with a calling to announce. She returned to New York as a young woman in the mid-1950s, and there she found the kind of work available to a woman without formal credentials or family wealth in that era: domestic work, caring for children in other people's households, the quiet, unglamorous labor of nannying, which she would go on to do for the rest of her working life. She eventually made her way to Chicago and settled into the North Shore suburbs north of the city, taking positions with one family after another over the following decades. She spent her days minding children, cooking simple meals, keeping households running in the background the way domestic workers so often did in that period, their names rarely appearing in any story except the ones told, much later, by the children they raised. What set Vivian Maier apart from the countless other women doing similar work in those same post-war decades was what she carried with her on her days off, and often even during her working hours, tucked beneath her coat or held loosely at her waist. A twin-lens Rolleiflex camera, boxy and solid, the kind that required a person to look down into the top of it rather than raise it to their eye. This meant she could photograph a crowded street while appearing, to anyone glancing her way, simply to be looking down in quiet thought. She used this particular way of holding the camera to move through the city almost invisibly, capturing children playing in the shadow of elevated train tracks, elderly men resting on stoops, women in fur coats stepping out of taxis. She captured, too, the particular exhausted dignity of factory workers at the end of a shift. All the small, passing dramas of ordinary urban life that most people walk past without truly seeing. There is something worth sitting with, in this part of the story, about the particular discipline of a life lived this way, work by day and private observation by the hours that belonged to no one else. Chicago in those decades was a city of hard, particular textures, the rattle and shriek of the elevated trains overhead, the cold wind coming off the lake in winter, the smell of the stockyards drifting through certain neighborhoods on a warm afternoon, the crowded bustle of the loop giving way, block by block, to quieter residential streets. Vivian Maier moved through all of it with the same unhurried attentiveness, her camera held low at her waist, the Rolleiflex's viewfinder angled downward so that she seemed, to any passerby, simply to be pausing in thought. It was this particular technical quirk of the camera's design, requiring the photographer to look down rather than raise the lens to eye level, that let her work so close to her subjects without ever seeming to intrude upon them. The families who employed her recalled a woman who was capable and reliable with the children in her care, though also famously private, guarded about her past, prone to using different versions of her name in different situations, someone who kept the door to her own life closed even to people she saw every day. She would take the children she cared for on long walks through parts of the city that other nannies might have avoided, stockyards and immigrant neighborhoods and rundown blocks, walks that were, in hindsight, as much about her own picture-taking as about giving the children fresh air. There is a particular kind of quiet fascination in imagining those afternoons, a woman pushing a stroller with one hand and steadying a camera at her waist with the other, absorbing a city that most of her employers' families would never have thought to look at so closely. Photography, for Vivian Maier, was never treated as a stepping stone toward anything else. She did not seek gallery representation, did not submit her work to magazines, did not, so far as anyone has ever been able to determine, show her photographs to more than a small handful of people in the whole of her adult life. The seasons turned in their unhurried way through these years of steady work, summers giving way to the particular gold light of a Midwestern autumn, then to the long grey stretch of winter, then to a spring that arrived, as it does in that part of the country, almost without warning. Through all of it, Vivian Maier's private practice continued undisturbed, roll after roll of film joining the growing collection in whatever storage she could arrange, the accumulation of decades quietly outpacing anyone's ability to fully account for it, including, in time, her own. The winters passed in Chicago the way winters do in that part of the country, long and grey, and marked by lake winds that cut through even a heavy coat, and Vivian Maier's life continued along its quiet, repeating pattern, one household after another, one roll of film after another, her private archive growing in silence in whatever closets or storage spaces she could arrange for it. She never married. She never, as far as the record shows, formed the kind of close, lasting friendships that might have drawn her private work into the light. She kept newspapers, sometimes in towering, precarious stacks, and grew, as she aged, increasingly protective of her few possessions and increasingly difficult for the families she worked for to accommodate, moving from position to position more frequently in her later years as her habits grew harder to manage within someone else's household. By the time she reached her final working years, in the late 1990s, Vivian Maier's circumstances had grown genuinely precarious. The steady income of domestic work had given way to something thinner and less certain, and the modest savings she had accumulated across a lifetime of careful, frugal living proved insufficient to keep pace with the costs of an aging body and a shrinking circle of employment. Among her possessions, scattered across several rented storage units in the Chicago area, sat the accumulated evidence of her whole private life's work: boxes of negatives, undeveloped rolls of film, prints she had made herself decades earlier, the physical weight of 150,000 unseen photographs slowly falling behind on their storage fees. In 2007, as happens when storage fees go unpaid for long enough, the contents of these units were sold at auction, sight unseen, to recover what money could be recovered, the ordinary and impersonal machinery by which forgotten belongings pass from one set of hands to another. Among the buyers that day was a young local historian and collector named John Maloof, who purchased a box of negatives largely on impulse, hoping they might contain material useful for a book he was working on about a Chicago neighborhood. He paid a modest sum for the box, brought it home, and began, in the unhurried way that such projects often begin, to scan the negatives one at a time. What he found, image after image, was not the ordinary neighborhood record he had expected, but something else entirely, a body of street photography of remarkable clarity and human insight, composed with an instinct for gesture and light that would not have looked out of place among the recognized street photographers of the 20th century. Faces caught in unguarded moments, the geometry of city streets rendered with quiet precision, children and beggars and society women photographed with the same unflinching, curious attention. What he found, image after image, was not the ordinary neighborhood record he had expected, but something else entirely, a body of street photography of remarkable clarity and human insight, composed with an instinct for gesture and light that would not have looked out of place among the recognized street photographers of the 20th century. Faces caught in unguarded moments, the geometry of city streets rendered with quiet precision, children and beggars and society women photographed with the same unflinching, curious attention. He spent long evenings at his own kitchen table scanning negative after negative, the images emerging slowly on his computer screen the way a photograph might once have emerged in a tray of developing chemical. It became clear to him, roll by roll, that whoever had made these pictures had possessed a rare and disciplined eye, and that there were, by every indication, many thousands more rolls exactly like the one he had bought almost by accident. There was no name attached to any of it beyond a faint scrawl on some of the film canisters, a name that took some further searching to trace back to an actual person, and by the time that search began in earnest, the name it led to belonged to a woman most people had already forgotten. It took time, patience, and a considerable amount of searching through public records and old employment connections before the name on those canisters could be matched to a living history. What emerged was the outline of a woman who had spent decades as a nanny in the very suburbs where the storage units had stood, a woman some of her former charges, now grown, still remembered with real affection from their own childhoods. It was through these grown children, tracked down and asked gently about a nanny they remembered from decades earlier, that the full shape of Vivian Maier's hidden life first began to come into focus, fragment by fragment, the way a photograph itself might slowly resolve in a tray of developing chemical, dim at first and then, gradually, unmistakably clear. By the time this search reached its natural conclusion, Vivian Maier herself was an elderly woman living out her final years in modest, difficult circumstances, her health failing, her finances thin, cared for in her last stretch of life by some of the very children she had once looked after, now adults with the means and the loyalty to make sure she was not left entirely without support. She passed away in April of 2009 in a nursing home in a Chicago suburb at the age of 83, only a short time after her photographs had first been rediscovered, and only a very little time before the wider world would come to understand what she had spent her private hours creating. She did not live to see the exhibitions that would eventually hang her work in galleries, did not read the reviews that would eventually place her name alongside the most respected street photographers of her era, did not attend the documentary screenings that would carry her face and her story to audiences on the other side of the world. She had already gone quiet, in the most final sense, before any of that quiet recognition arrived. There is a kind of stillness worth sitting with in this part of the story, in the space between a life lived in almost total privacy and a legacy that would, within just a few years of her death, become genuinely well known. It raises a question that has no tidy answer about what it might have meant to Vivian Maier herself had she lived to see it, to have her private observations of ordinary life suddenly celebrated as art. Those who study her life are left, in the end, simply with the evidence of what she chose to do while she was living, decade after decade of quiet, careful looking, undertaken for reasons she never explained to anyone, and perhaps never fully articulated even to herself. It may be enough, in telling her story now, simply to hold that choice with respect rather than to resolve it into any single, tidy meaning. What followed her death unfolded slowly, the way these things tend to. Exhibitions organized first in smaller venues and then in larger ones. Prints made carefully from negatives that had waited, undeveloped, for half a century or more. Documentary film was assembled from interviews with the very families who had once employed her, each contributing another small piece to the portrait of a woman who had walked through their childhoods with a camera at her waist and had never once explained why. Her photographs began to travel, hung in galleries in Chicago and New York and eventually across Europe, admired by people who would never have had occasion to meet the woman who made them, who knew her, if they knew her at all, only through the evidence of what she had noticed and chosen to preserve. The documentary that eventually told her story to a wider audience was built almost entirely from these second-hand recollections, since Vivian Maier herself left behind no interviews, no personal essays, nothing in her own voice explaining what the photographs had meant to her. What emerged instead was a portrait assembled the way a photograph itself might be assembled from many small points of light and shadow, each former employer or grown child contributing one more fragment, one more half-remembered detail. A habit of speaking with a faint accent she never fully explained, a fierce protectiveness over a locked steamer trunk, a way of disappearing for hours on her days off and returning without ever saying where she had been. Audiences who watched this documentary in theaters and later at home found themselves drawn into the same quiet puzzle that had first faced the families searching for her name, piecing together a life from its edges because its center had never been offered to anyone. It is worth pausing, before this story settles toward its close, to consider the ordinary days out of which all of this eventually grew. A woman walking a child to the park on an overcast Chicago afternoon, pausing at the sight of an old man resting on a bench, lowering her gaze into the top of a boxy camera and pressing the shutter once, quietly, before continuing on her way as though nothing at all had happened. Multiply that single, unremarkable gesture by tens of thousands of afternoons, across decades of employment in households that came and went, and the sheer accumulated patience of it becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind all at once. She was not working toward an exhibition. She could not have been, since she showed almost no one what she made. She was simply, faithfully, continuing to look. The rediscovery of her work has, in the years since, prompted no small amount of discussion among historians and photographers about what her intentions might have been, whether she meant, eventually, to share this vast private archive, or whether the making of it was itself sufficient, a private practice complete in itself regardless of whether anyone else ever saw it. There is no diary entry, no letter, no recorded statement from Vivian Maier herself that settles this question definitively. And perhaps it is fitting that a woman who guarded her privacy so carefully throughout her life should leave behind a mystery on this point as well. One final quiet room that no amount of searching has fully opened. What can be said with more certainty is this, that a woman born into a scattered, uncertain family who spent her working life in the background of other people's households, who never sought recognition and very likely never expected it, left behind, in the end, one of the more remarkable bodies of street photography of the 20th century. It was 150,000 quiet observations of ordinary life, made by someone who asked nothing from any of it beyond the simple, private satisfaction of having looked closely enough to remember. Some of those grown children, in the years since, have spoken about the strange experience of realizing, decades after the fact, that the quiet woman who had once packed their lunches and walked them to school had been carrying, all the while, an entire secret creative life beneath the surface of their shared, ordinary days. Few recalled being taken along on some of her long photographic walks without ever understanding, at the time, what she was really doing, remembering only that she paused often, crouched sometimes at odd angles, asked them to wait a moment while she looked at something across the street. None of them, by their own accounts, ever thought to ask her directly what she saw in these moments, and she, for her part, never offered an explanation, so that the full meaning of those pauses remained invisible to everyone involved until long after she could no longer be asked. The children she once pushed through Chicago streets in their strollers are, themselves, now well into their own later years. Many of them speak of her still with a particular warmth, remembering not a mysterious artist, but a woman who took them for long walks, who was careful with them, who was, in her own guarded way, present for the small, unremarkable moments of their own growing up, never once mentioning what she carried beneath her coat or why. Galleries in cities she had never visited, in countries she had never seen, began hanging her prints on their walls within just a few years of her death. Visitors who paused in front of a photograph of a Chicago street corner from 1962 had no way of knowing, unless they read the small placard beside it, that the woman who made it had spent that same decade pushing other people's children through those very streets, unpaid for the images and unseen in the making of them, her name absent from any record but the film itself. The seasons have turned many times now since that storage unit was auctioned off in 2007, and Vivian Maier's photographs continue to travel to new cities, to be studied by new students of photography, to be looked at by people who never knew her and never will. There is something quietly fitting in that continuation. A woman who spent her life watching others now, in turn, being watched herself. Her images turned over and considered with the same unhurried attention she once gave to the strangers she photographed on the streets of Chicago and New York. She is buried in a modest plot outside the city she called home for so many decades, and the stone that marks her resting place carries her name simply, without embellishment, in keeping, perhaps, with a life that asked to be left alone and was, for most of its span, granted exactly that. Visitors to that quiet cemetery today are sometimes people who have come specifically because of the photographs. Strangers who never met her, kneeling briefly at a grave that gives away almost nothing of what the woman beneath it once carried through the streets of two great cities. So this story settles here, the way these stories tend to, not with a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet, accumulated weight of 150,000 ordinary moments, held privately for decades and only now, finally, being seen. There is a particular kind of comfort in a life like this one, in the reminder that meaning does not require an audience to be real, that a woman could spend her whole working life caring for other people's children, while quietly, faithfully building something of lasting value entirely for herself, asking nothing from the world in return beyond the simple permission to keep looking. It is a comfort worth carrying gently into rest, the thought that a quiet, unnoticed life can still, in its own time and in its own way, turn out to have mattered. Thank you for spending this time here, in the slow unfolding of a life that was carried on so quietly for so long. If it is evening where this finds you, let the story settle now the way the light once settled over those Chicago streets, gently, without hurry, as the rest of the world grows quiet around you. Sleep well.